Now we wait. Oh, there we go. Welcome in, latest episode of that SEC podcast. I'm your host, Michael Bratton. I go by SEC Mike on Twitter, and it's SEC After Dark with our good buddy Stephen Lassan, senior editor over at Athlon Sports. Stephen, how's it going?
Hey, Mike, it's great. It's good to be back talking with you and all the cousins tonight. A little SEC After Dark. Always good to talk to you guys. I have to apologize. I don't have a 100-mile-an-hour fastball coach scouting this week. So I do have some other good news though, that the Athlon Sports Magazine is on newsstands. So that is some good news, right?
Absolutely. So, and if you can't physically go to the store, Athlon's got that official link to where you can buy the magazine online. Once this video is done, I'll put it in the comments. I'll pin it to the top of this video, so it's very easy for all the cousins out there to purchase their own version that'll get delivered right to their house. But throw Steven and the fine folks over at Athlon Sports a bone. They put in a ton of work to get you this magazine. So, hey, college football season right around the corner, and it ain't real till we get that Athlon Sports in our heads. You know what?
Absolutely. That before I started working at Athlon, that was kind of like my point. Like, hey, the off season's over. You got the magazine in hand. We're ready to preview the season, and now it's going to be even like a second preseason ending when the game comes out. So you got the game, you got the magazine. You and I were just talking at the off season's just kind of quickly dwindling away here. We're kind of running out of time on some of our ideas for SEC After Dark. So man, the season will be here before you know it. So get that Athlon Sports Magazine and get prepared.
Yeah. Like Steven said, we were just discussing, what are we going to talk about? Heck, we only got a couple of weeks left before the college football season gets here. We get to the actual game. So again, credit Steven, came up with another outstanding concept for this episode of the show. We're going to go over the first team all SEC selections that Steven has compiled, and then I'm going to rip them to shreds. And we also got most underrated players. We got at least one for every single SEC team. And hotty toddy, cousin Brandon gave us $20. Appreciate you, cousin Brandon there.
Thanks, cuz.
Yeah, thank you so much, man. We do appreciate you. But hey, since Brandon's already given us a donation, Steven, again, we're going to do all SEC here in a minute, but maybe we want to give a shout out to most underrated players from Ole Miss. Anyone stand out in your mind?
Mike, I've got 3 players from Ole Miss that I think I would consider underrated. And I think my definition of this, and Mike, feel free to critique it, was try to pick guys who aren't going to be on your breakout team. Like, pick guys who've been pretty solid for the last maybe year or so. Maybe they're upperclassmen, and we think they deserve a little bit more love. So I've got 3 guys. I'll throw them out here for Ole Miss. I'll start with Caleb Warren, the center. We've talked all offseason about Jackson Dart, Trey Harris, Juice Wells. You've got all these weapons. Well, it doesn't matter unless your offensive line's pretty good. Caleb Warren's on the Senior Bowl watch list for 2024. He's been a starter at guard and center, very versatile. Having a kind of standout center to protect your quarterback in a big year, I think that's a pretty big deal for Ole Miss. So I've got Caleb Warren, and then after that, I've got a duo of defensive linemen. Everybody's talking about transfers. Princely, Walter Nolan. Don't forget about Jared Ivey. 11 and a half tackles for loss. He led the team in that department last year. He was also a beast in that bowl game against Penn State, if you have to think back to what feels like ages ago. And also, I had to mention J.J. Pegues. Let's get the big man a rushing touchdown this year, right? He's been pretty solid on defense, so let's get him a rushing touchdown.
Yeah, and I said, because I as soon as you said that, I knew you were going to hit on the guy I had. I got J.J. Pegues as well. Clearly Auburn, they had no clue what to do with the big man there. He was what they do. They try to make him a tight end. They try to make him a fullback, jumping over people. My goodness. But at his size, his explosiveness, it really seemed to me that if he's got a future in football, and I'm talking NFL, he's got to play on the defensive side of the football, and that's what he does now for Ole Miss. And yeah, he's, again, like Steven was saying, these are not necessarily guys that we think are going to, be All-American or anything like that. And it's very easy to look at like second-year players and say, well, this guy's going to break out. But we're just trying to look at guys that are not being recognized maybe nationally, that have been doing a good job, that we expect will have really good seasons. And for me, it is J.J. Pegues, who's still learning the defensive line position for Ole Miss. But with Walter Nolan there, like you said, with Princely coming aboard, offenses are going to have to be focused on those guys. It's going to give players like J.J. Pegues an opportunity to step up in a big way for the Ole Miss Rebels this fall.
Mike, something else I think as we're talking about this Ole Miss defensive front, which I think it's probably going to be one of the top 10 to 12 in college football. I don't think we would have said that, last season or the year before, but I think we've now mentioned Jared Ivey, Pegues, we've mentioned Princely, we mentioned Walter Nolan. They're deeper up front than they were last season for sure. So a guy like Pegues, who, is at his size and ability to stop the run and some of the, like you said, the explosiveness there, maybe he doesn't have to play as many snaps. But that's okay, because maybe you keep him fresher for being in the fourth quarter, which just helps the Ole Miss defense all around. So I really like Ivy and Pegues. I know they're going to be in a little bit in the background this year, but those two guys, that defensive front for Ole Miss is going to be much improved in 2024.
Right, and we got another one from Cousin Nick. Hail State, the Egg Bowl rivalry alive and well. So let's do Mississippi State, Stephen. Who stood out to you as an underrated player for the Bulldogs?
So I sort of bent the rules a little bit here. I mentioned a transfer. He's my guy from UTEP, and that is Kelly Akari. I feel like I watched every UTEP game on Tuesday and Wednesday night last year in October. So I just like the way that he fits into this offense, even though he's a transfer, a first-year player. Bad quarterback play at UTEP, almost 22 yards per catch. He is moving up the ladder in terms of competition, so things will get tougher in the SEC. But when I think about like Jeff Lebby offenses and off the Baylor tree, you always have to have somebody with some speed to push it downfield, even if it's just to open up the other receivers. A lot of those receivers run dummy routes, basically, just to open up everything else. So at his speed, we've already seen him make an impact in the spring game. I don't know that Akari coming in is going to be a guy who gets a lot of all SEC love, but I like his potential right away. It would not be surprising to me to see Blake Shapen and Akari hooking up on some big plays early in the season. And Mike, I also like Corey Ellington, the safety for Mississippi State. I mean, 2 returning starters this year. He's one of them. Went from part-time in 2022 as kind of a backup player to full-time last year. And he kind of stuffed the stat sheet. 66 tackles, picked up a couple sacks, tackles for loss, a pass breakup, and a forced fumble. For a Mississippi State defense with a lot of new faces, I think he should be one of the leaders for that group this year.
Yeah, well, you know what they say, Stephen, great minds think alike. I love Kelly Akari. I think he's a candidate. He may have 100 catches this year, just given the offense, the tempo they want to run there in Jeff Lebby's system. So that's one heck of a player selection. But I didn't go with transfer. I went with Corey Ellington, believe it or not. So this is no shot at him whatsoever. But also, it was difficult to pick one for Mississippi State because so many players left. Now, that's going to be across the board, basically, when you get a former coach out the door that was not doing a good job. We don't have to rehash last season, but not a lot of options. But Corey Ellington was a heck of a player from Mississippi State. Be fascinated to see what they do on the defensive side of the football after, they have been pretty stingy the last couple of years. So Corey Ellington, one of the better defensive players back in the SEC next season. I don't think enough people know his name for the production he's had the last couple of seasons.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think when you think about safety, Malachi Starks is going to be a name that jumps out. And, we'll talk about some other safeties and some other defensive backs this year. But it is a pretty, I think, open year, for a guy like Ellington, not getting probably enough preseason buzz with all the changes at Mississippi State. Like you said, I had a hard time with this one. Only 2 returning starters. And I'm looking at my sheet going, the X amount of players from the top 20 tacklers last year is gone. Like, who are your best choices? Well, a guy that was solid last year, but not only that, I mean, a guy that could really, I think, even take his game up another notch this season. So I think Ellington could be a really solid piece for this Mississippi State defense.
Yeah. Well, all right, Stephen, I'm not seeing any donations, so let's go in alphabetical till we get one, and then we can mix it up here. But we always seem to start at the A's. Let's go in reverse order. And this is going to be tricky because Man, I've been pulled over before. They make you do the ABCs backwards. It's very difficult to do. But let's do Vanderbilt. Let's get them, Stephen. Who's an underrated Commodore for you?
I think the most underrated Commodore for me is CJ Taylor. Kind of like I mentioned with Corey Ellington, like the way that he stuffed the stat sheet as a safety last season, over 50 tackles, couple picks, couple sacks, forced fumbles, like all the things that you want to see as sort of a defensive playmaker for a Vanderbilt team that needs some guys to put, to step up their game to make all SEC honors. Also, I thought it was notable. He did not allow a touchdown last year in coverage. So not only the statistics were there, the advanced analytics kind of backed up what was a solid season. I think offensively, it's tough to find a player for Vanderbilt that could be underrated. I'll throw out Gunnar Hansen. He's been a 2-year starter for Vanderbilt. And I know a lot of room to improve across the board, but for a Vanderbilt team that's got a 2-year starter starting at left tackle, I think that's a pretty solid building block for that group.
Yeah. No offense for me, Steven. I don't respect Vanderbilt's offense at this point in time. So you got no under. Well, I do like Seth Alexander, the running back. So we'll give him a bone. But I'm going to go Langston Patterson at linebacker. Again, I guess you could probably say the same thing about Vanderbilt's defense. It's been rough, but with Clark Lee taking that thing back over, I think they're going to be much improved on the defensive side of the football. And I think they got some nice pieces on the defensive side of the football. But give me Patterson. Very productive last couple of years there at Vanderbilt, but it's kind of hard to recognize it when they're just getting destroyed on most Saturdays.
Is CJ Taylor too high profile for you? Did you consider him at all, or were you pretty set on Patterson?
Yeah, I think CJ Taylor, to me, he's already one of the more established players in the SEC, so I think he's properly rated, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think he should be on the All SEC team somewhere this year. There's a lot of really quality defensive backs coming back into the league this year. But he should find a way on there. I think that the thing with Patterson too is you look at his numbers last season, over 70 tackles, 8 tackles for loss. With Clark Lee, his background coaching linebackers. Maybe he can help Patterson, especially this year. Now he's taking over the play calling duties, take his game up a notch. So I think if you're looking at all SEC, like Vanderbilt does have a couple guys who should be in there. So I will agree with your selection of Patterson. I think it's pretty solid.
All right. How about, again, we're going to reverse order till we get a donation here. How about A&M, Stephen? Who's some underrated Aggies?
I'll go with a guy. I kind of wrestled with this one, because I kind of wondered if he was almost a bounce back candidate or if he fit better in underrated. I went with Donovan Green. I think people kind of forget that he was really solid in 2022. 22 catches, and certainly I think is a pretty solid offensive structure now with a healthy Connor Wigman. Colin Klein used a couple tight ends at Kansas State very effectively, including one that was drafted this year in Ben Sinnott. So I think A&M's going to do a good job of getting him involved. Maybe he's more of a bounce back candidate, but I kind of feel in the SEC discussion of tight ends, we've talked about Caden Prieskorn, Fairweather from Auburn, Luke Haas from Arkansas, maybe not forgetting about Donovan Green. I have a couple guys on defense, Mike, but I'll throw it to you and see if you agree or you think that's a crazy selection.
No, that's a good one, and I didn't even really consider him, but he would have been fit into that breakout candidate last season before he got injured, unfortunately. So hopefully he's back in time. But I'm going with Moose Muhammad. I think Moose Muhammad. So much attention given to Evan Stewart, and for good reason. He was a very good player, but I thought Moose Muhammad has been highly productive. He wasn't always allowed to play because he had sleeves for some damn reason. That was a hard no for Jimbo Fisher. Another reason to get his ass out of here. But he can wear sleeves anytime he wants because he's a game breaker. And I think Moose Muhammad, I'm not ready to say like all SEC, but I think he could flirt with that. If A&M does what I think they can do, they're going to need some guys to step up. Give me Moose Muhammad as an underrated SEC player.
It's a good pick, Mike. I think a lot of people probably forget that. I think he was second on the team last year. in receiving yards, that being 2022. And then, of course, last year, Sleevegate cost him a lot of production. It's just the stupidest stuff that cost him a lot of playing time last year. But I think one other thing on A&M, too, I think, yes, they are losing Anaya Smith. They're losing Evan Stewart. But between Ja'Day Walker, Noah Thomas, Moose Muhammad, they've got a really solid trio. You throw in Donovan Green. I'm not that worried about losing Evan Stewart. Obviously, he's very good, but they've got a nice trio. A couple guys I'll throw out there in defense. I don't know if Shamar Turner is properly rated or underrated. It feels like I have not seen a single soul talk about him at all this offseason on a national level. So maybe on the national level, he's being a little bit undervalued. He was only second team all SEC last year, but 6 sacks, 10.5 tackles for a loss. Also, Bryce Anderson, 7 tackles for a loss, 4 pass breakups, pretty solid year from a safety. And he may have been overshadowed by the fact that A&M had such a struggle at times stopping the pass.
Yeah, no, I like those selections, Stephen. I think they could all potentially be all SEC caliber type players. So, yeah, I can't bicker with any of those, to be honest with you.
I was on the fence about Shamar Turner because he did make all SEC, and he's probably going to be pretty highly rated on my all SEC team this season. So it is a struggle, I think, to figure out. Maybe he's properly rated, but maybe underrated nationally.
Hey, shout out cousin Rick.
Thanks, cuz.
Ruben Owens beefed up, expected for a breakout year. So that's the running back. That's a heck of a selection. I would say the only problem with that, Stephen, is and not that this is a good problem to have, but in my mind, A&M's basically 3 strong at running back. So I think you would kind of split the carries, so to speak. So, maybe if there was just 2, but of course there's injuries, there's all kinds of things that could happen. But Ruben Owens, former 5-star, second-year player, he is primed big time for a breakout candidate. He could be, you could kind of convince me that any of the 3 running backs in the rotation down there are primed for a breakout. And hopefully, again, without being handcuffed by Jimbo Fisher, hopefully they're all breakout candidates.
Yeah, I think it's a problem for like SEC voting is figuring out which running back you like after ETN, because there's a lot of good ones. I don't know which one has the easiest path to carries. Like, I really like Ruben Owens. I think, to his point, that he's going to be one of my breakout candidates for sure this year. But how many carries can he peel away from Daniels, Moss as well? Ultimately, talent probably wins out, and he probably ends up becoming the number 1 back. But for sure, pencil me in as Ruben Owens' breakout believer this year.
And how about this comment from Liquid Flames? Right now, it's the best comment of the evening so far. I'm learning about all the players that are going to burn the Gators this season. That don't come at Liquid. He's a big Florida fan, so he's called out his own team there. But that's great.
Oh man, I don't get a sense that there's a ton of optimism there from him about the Ron Roberts hire, right?
No, not yet. But that could change. All right, how about Texas, Stephen? This was tougher for me because they're new to the SEC. They're not as I'm not as knowledgeable on them, so I'll lean heavily on you for Texas and Oklahoma.
I think one guy that I really like in Texas' secondary probably hasn't gotten enough love in the nation, but that is Ja'Day Barron. He's been kind of a chess piece in that Longhorn secondary. I think what's interesting is when you look at his snaps breakdown, around 400 snaps in the slot, about 150 in the box. He's played some corner and he's played some true safety. So really versatile player that I think in a secondary that comes into the season with some questions. Malik Muhammad's a breakout candidate, but they need Ja'Day Barron to be that leader and also to kind of continue that progression that we've seen the last couple of years. So I think, where does he fit in? Where does he line up this season will be kind of a piece of intrigue, but I think he's definitely underrated coming into this year. And I'll also throw out Jake Majors, the center for Texas, 41 starts for the Longhorns, much like Caleb Warren we talked about with Ole Miss. You got a veteran leading the way up front to team with Kelvin Banks, one of the best tackles in the country. Majors did not allow a sack last season, so he's been rock solid for the Longhorns at the middle of that offensive line.
Mm-hmm. Now, again, this might be an obvious one, Stephen, and this guy probably doesn't fit the criteria. It's kind of more of the breakout, and I hate to be so confusing for the audience here because we're trying to do most underrated, but again, because my knowledge is not where some of these others. I went with linebacker Anthony Hill, who I think we could all agree is primed for a huge breakout season. So I'm kind of putting him underrated. He was a terror when they played Alabama. Thoughts on that selection?
Love it. I think he's more breakout for me. But as far as when I think about, we just mentioned Malik Muhammad, but Anthony Hill, and throw in the transfer they picked up from UTSA to get after the quarterback, Makubia, the safety from Clemson. They've got some chess pieces there to be pretty versatile and also to kind of fix some of their defensive issues. And one of those ways is Anthony Hill taking that next step forward. So I like that call.
All right, Stephen, how about them Vols? Tennessee, lot of candidates here underrated. Where would you go for Tennessee's most underrated players?
Mike, I had a hard time with this one. I think there are a couple guys at the line of scrimmage I'm going to kind of highlight here. I think one on the offensive side of the ball would be Cooper Mays. I think keeping him healthy, keeping him kind of managing the pivot there on the offensive line, really crucial to Tennessee's hopes. This offensive line should be, I think, top 10 potentially in the country this year. So I think Cooper Mays probably a little bit undervalued as we go into preseason voting. And on the defensive side, I kind of just grabbed a couple players here because they all kind of fit into the same thing. And that is Bryson Eason, Amari Thomas, and Keenan Peely. The middle of that defense for Tennessee. Elijah Herring transferring out. That means that Peely, the BYU transfer, are going to be counted on even more this year. And you got guys like Eason and Thomas who were kind of rock solid pieces to that defense last year to go with James Pierce, forming a defensive line that I think was also probably top 12 in the country right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I like those selections, Stephen, and go back and check it out. Anybody missed it last week? We had Austin Price on the show, but he gave a shout out to Keenan Peely and just how instrumental he is for the defense, and given the fact that when he went down last season, the defense never recovered, and the fact that now they're going to have the helmet communication. Peely will be that guy on the defensive side of the football that'll wear the communication. So I think that's an outstanding selection. But I went with John Campbell, right tackle this year. I think he played a little out of position at left tackle last year, so that's kind of why I view him as underrated. I think he's better suited for right tackle, teaming him up with Lance Hurd, the transfer from LSU. And I think that could really, really, really benefit Nico this year, having those two bookend tackles. And, you just don't hear a ton about John Campbell, but hey, last time they had a right tackle they were happy with. He went number 10 overall in the NFL draft. And I'm not saying John Campbell is that, but I think the offensive line coach they have, Glenn Ellerby, the system that they run there, I think they'll get the most out of John Campbell. And I don't think enough is talked about with him. And if Tennessee's offense does what I think they can do, I think he'll be in consideration for all SEC by the end of the year.
I have to agree with you, Mike. I think, first of all, I think Lance Hurd is probably going to be, if I'm guessing from an upside perspective, a lot of people will probably look at him and maybe vote him ahead of someone like Campbell on the All-SEC just because of raw talent. But I think to your point, maybe getting Campbell on the right side is kind of where he needs to have a home. He can have a home on the right side of that offensive line, solidify that to go with Hurd on the other side. So I think all in all, I think what we're kind of hinting at here, or kind of hitting, is that Tennessee's got a couple guys who should be all SEC along the offensive line, and getting someone like Hurd in kind of fit the puzzle all together to go with a really good center and a tackle who should also be all SEC. So I like that call in Campbell.
And hey, cousin Brandon he's got a question for us. He donated. So Ole Miss, he wants to know Deion Smith. I think that guy is going to kill it. Best receiver room in the country. Well, you're gonna want to see Stephen's all SEC first team ballot because he may agree with you with that assessment. But any thoughts on Deion Smith, Stephen?
Which team?
For Ole Miss, he's I think he's a JUCO guy that just signed. I think he was number 2 overall JUCO prospect. I'm just looking up, but I don't have much knowledge on the JUCO football. I gotta be quite honest with you.
Yeah, I gotta be honest with you too. The JUCOs are kind of something I'm going to study a little bit more this offseason because we're just getting the transfers and still trying to get through the recruiting front. But I think in general, I think when you look at the Ole Miss roster right now, pretty stacked from a two deep. So I think it's going to be kind of, and JUCO too, I should say. One of the things that always interests me is how fast those guys acclimate to the SEC. It may take another season. The JUCOs are kind of a little different than I think just a regular 4-year transfer.
Right. And if memory serves, I think he went to LSU and then he had to go JUCO and now he's at Ole Miss. If I have that right. And if I do, I mean, if LSU's taking you at receiver, you are one hell of a player given their track record of developing guys. So, yeah, and imagine if Deion Smith is being asked to be, the 4th or 5th best receiver at Ole Miss, yeah, they're going to have quite the receiver room to put it mildly.
Yeah, I think so. I think kind of, when I start thinking about the Ole Miss receiving core for this season, I think a lot of people are going to rank, Oklahoma, Missouri, Texas. There's a ton of Tennessee, Alabama. There's a ton of Georgia, great ones in the SEC. But I think on Smith specifically, I think as far as finding playing time in a starter role, I don't know if they necessarily need that, though. I mean, you've got, like you said, Harris, Watkins, Prieskorn at tight end, throw in Juice Wells. I mean, they just also reeled in a couple guys from the portal. I think one from Southern Illinois and Jordan Smart from North Texas. So I don't think they necessarily need Deion to be a difference maker right away in sort of like a 80 snaps a game. Maybe you sort of situationally find him in, but that also kind of gets back to kind of what I think about JUCOs is you kind of it may take them half a season to get going. So broad point here, I think Ole Miss is stacked at receiver. Don't necessarily need somebody to come in and play a ton of snaps right away, but still a very good pickup for Ole Miss, obviously.
And I think the ideal scenario down there in Oxford, Stephen, would be a guy like Deion Smith comes in, learns the system, maybe starts a little slow like you're suggesting, and then Trey Harris and Juice Wells go on to the NFL. Boom, you've got Deion Smith next year to step into one of those roles. I would imagine that's the game plan down there.
Has to be, and I think there was a couple of times where Kiffin took some transfers and it kind of looked like it was more for 2025, 2026 because they have so many upperclassmen at certain positions this year. So I think anytime you got somebody with that amount of talent, you have the scholarship space, you go out and get them. And, Ole Miss and Mississippi State have had good track records, some JUCO guys being able to come in and play. But also note too, and I mentioned him before, whatever Ole Miss is doing late in the portal, I like it. I mean, they've been on got Chris Hardy, that pass rusher from Jacksonville State, who can come in and give them some situational snaps off the edge. So just all around, whether it's JUCO, 4-year transfer, I like what Ole Miss has done on the roster front this offseason.
All right, how about South Carolina, Stephen? I think there's a lot of good candidates for the Gamecocks. Most underrated player for Shane Beamer and company.
I got two. And I've got one specifically that I think could make a run at first team all SEC honors, and that is Debo Williams at linebacker. I know this offseason will be about Harold Perkins and Danny Stutzman and Michael Williams, but Debo Williams was awesome last year, 113 tackles, second team all SEC by the Associated Press. I think he could take his game up another notch this year. Also, I'll throw out Tonka Hemingway. Been a solid player on the interior for South Carolina. We know they need to get better against the run. He was pretty solid last year by some of the advanced metrics that I looked at. So I think Tonka Hemingway and Debo Williams would be my picks.
Stephen, you're too good, Steve. I got Debo Williams too, man. I was hoping you didn't have him on your list, but yeah, I don't think he gets the recognition he deserves. Everything you just mentioned, I think, and I've been running the numbers again. I'm throwing up these graphics, and they got returning production, all that. That again, that's from Bill Connolly's stuff, and I'm doing my own. I've been posting that for anybody that's been paying attention. And South Carolina is just so high on all the defensive lists. So I think South Carolina is going to be vastly improved on that side of the football, and we'll start to see some names like Debo Williams get the recognition they deserve this fall.
Also, I really like the potential. I know they got torched at times last year, but South Carolina's secondary could be better with a lot of the returning personnel at corner and safety. So I think optimistically here, if you're South Carolina, Debo Williams takes a step forward. You get some better pass rush this year from some of the guys you brought in the portal. Late in the season, we saw that 3-3-5 start to work, and they kind of got better there. So I think there's a lot of reasons to be optimistic if you're South Carolina going into this year, and cross your fingers for better luck in the health department too.
Yep. All right, Stephen, how about Oklahoma? Who you got for the Sooners? Underrated.
Mike, I got a couple picks here. I'm going to start at receiver. I'm going to give two guys. I mentioned last week how much I love their receiving core, but I think Jalil Farouk and Andro Anthony are underrated. It's kind of weird to say that because they have a top 10 receiving core, but Deion Burks, Nick Anderson are probably going to get most of the preseason buzz. But Farouk has gotten better every season at Oklahoma, probably had his best all-around season in 2023, nearly 700 yards receiving. Also, Anthony was on pace for a really kind of a breakout year last season. He caught 27 passes in the first 6 games, but he suffered a season-ending injury. So I think certainly Nick Anderson, Farouk, Deion Burke's going to get all the preseason buzz, but that depth allows you to bring someone like Anthony back slow and give him a chance to kind of get back into the offense. So I really like both of those guys for the Oklahoma receiving core. I'll throw out one guy on defense too, Mike. I think Ethan Downs might be a guy who makes a run at all SEC honors this year. He had 22 quarterback hurries last season. That was the most on the team. Lots of really good pieces on the DL coming back in the SEC, but I think Ethan Downs certainly could be in that conversation too.
Mm-hmm. Now, maybe I may have missed the mark here with the Sooners. Again, my knowledge is not where it is with some of these other SEC teams, but I don't hear enough buzz about Nick Anderson. I know you just shouted him out, but I believe last year he broke the Oklahoma record for most touchdowns from a freshman. So he is already quite well established, but not seeing a ton of buzz for him. Basically what I did, it again, spoiler, I guess here, but anybody that Steven didn't have on his first team all SEC, I said, well, they must be underrated then, right? So I think Nick Anderson, you said it there, Oklahoma, they're battling in the comments right now, Steven. Ole Miss, Mizzou, Oklahoma, they're all, we got the best receiving core. Tennessee fans saying it too. But as we run through this list, there's several teams that have one heck of a claim to that title, and the fact that a guy like Nick Anderson, who scored, I believe, 10 touchdowns last year, not even first team All SEC, I think that's an indication of just how good that receiving core for the Sooners is.
Absolutely. I think, and also in Oklahoma's case, it might be strength in numbers. They may not have a guy first, and we'll see about second, third team SEC. I'm pretty sure they'll get somebody on there. But there's a definite strength in numbers for Oklahoma this year because, like you said, Anderson had 10 touchdown catches, 21 yards per catch on 38 receptions last season. So he was really kind of a breakout star last season. But in the broad sense of nationally, not getting enough love by far. I think everybody's talking about Deion Burks because of the spring game, and that's totally fine. He's going to be great. But let's not forget Nick Anderson too.
All right. How about Cousin Shay's Missouri Tigers here? A lot of good candidates for them. Who's an underrated Tiger in your mind?
Mike, I've got 4.
Baby.
So I'll throw them out. I came prepared, Mike. Let's start at receiver, right? That's where we just ended with Oklahoma. How about Theo Wees?
Yeah.
Luther Burden, obviously, I think Luther Burden, pound for pound, might be the best player in college football this year. But Theo Wees, rock solid in 2023. Nearly 50 catches, nearly 700 yards, a career season in his first year with Missouri. So no doubt about it. This is not to take anything away from Luther Burden. This is Luther Burden putting an immense shadow on Missouri's receiving core and forgetting how good Theo Wees has been. Connor Tolleson at center. Really solid. Like if you look at the advanced metrics on Tolleson, got a lot better from year 1 to year 2. Now you have some turnover on the offensive line. So bringing him back to man the pivot there, that will keep Missouri's offensive line performing well, I think. And then on defense, I threw out Christian Williams and Johnny Walker. 2 guys who are sort of like the last man standing on the defensive front after all that turnover, but were 2 really solid players last season.
Yeah, well, you did so many. You were bound to get by guys, Steve.
Sorry.
So, no worries, man. I appreciate the knowledge. But I went with Johnny Walker as well. given, there's a lot of buzz, and deservedly so, that Missouri could have one of, if not the best offense in the SEC. But I'm starting to hear all these doubters. Well, they lost Blake Baker. They lost Darius Robinson. They lost Hopper. How can they ever recover? Well, I think a year ago, nobody knew who those guys were outside of Missouri fans. So they got another generation. They got Johnny Walker. They got the defensive coordinator for South Alabama. I know everybody wants to credit Kane Womack for everything he did down there, but I don't know. We'll find out this fall for real. So I think Johnny Walker's a name that doesn't get discussed quite often enough, and he's going to have a big year for Missouri.
Also worth keeping a watch on what happens with Simeon Barrow, the Michigan State transfer who was supposedly going to Miami. Doesn't look like he's going to Miami now. I know Missouri was one of those teams that were in the mix for him. I think a guy that could be a difference maker on that defensive front, a rebuilt guy, could be a run stuffer. He was kind of, I think, going to be all Big Ten this preseason if he didn't leave Michigan State. So I think just in general, there is a lot of turnover, and I think understandably there will be doubts about the secondary defensive line. But when you look at the transfers that Missouri brought in, I think there's also reason to believe they can keep pace with what they did last year.
Right. All right. How about them LSU Tigers, Stephen? Who's your underrated Tigers?
Mike, I need a ruling. Kyron Lacey, undervalued.
You could throw him in there.
Okay.
He's certainly, I don't want to say unproven, but just given their recent track record, I think that's a solid option.
I think maybe he's underrated because we all, and rightfully so, remember how good Malik Neighbors and Brian Thomas were last year. I mean, those guys were stars, All-America caliber contributors. But Kyron Lacey's numbers, 38 catches for over 500 yards and 7 touchdowns. So I think he kind of fits into both, probably underrated from what happened last year, but also the breakout potential to do even more this year for LSU. So I've got two, Mike, I've got 2 more, but I'm going to let you have the next pick before I take any more of your players.
All right, I'm going tight end Mason Taylor. And again, maybe he's already properly rated for some, but I think he's a little lost in the shuffle there with all the weapons they had last season. But with a new quarterback, and I know they're very high on Garrett Nussmeier down in Baton Rouge, but I don't even know if you can call him a young quarterback because he's been around so long. He's made some starts. He's made some big time throws, but a new quarterback, let's just say that's fair. At least new starting. I think he'll rely on his tight end a ton. I think Mason Taylor's going to have a big year for LSU, given a lot of production that has to be replaced. Give me Mason Taylor.
I like it. He was on my short list for this as well. So I'll stay on the offensive side of the ball. I'll mention the guards, Garrett Dellinger and Miles Frazier. Obviously, a ton of spotlight on Campbell and Emory Jones. It's one of the best tackle pairings in college football. Both should be either first team All SEC. One might be second team, however you want to slice it. But there's no question that's one of the best tackle duos in the country. But the 2 guards coming back, I think, are critical as well because LSU is going to be breaking in a new center. So you have sort of kind of an insulated group. You're protecting your center with some experienced guards. Both of those guys have been rock solid for the LSU offensive line the last couple years. I did struggle to find somebody on LSU's defense I might consider underrated. Mike, would you agree with that?
They're all overrated on defense at LSU. So I think that's fair. But I'm kind of kidding, but for those just listening back, again, I got the graphic on the screen, LSU's offense last year. Where did LSU rank in national scoring efficiency? Yards per pass, yards per rush, explosive pass. Number 1 in the country in all of those, and number 2 in the country. This is not SEC, the country, in third down success rate. I'm just shaking my head at how you have this dynamic of an offense and losing 3 games and not doing more. I do not understand the LSU hype because they're not going to come close to touching these numbers on the offensive side of the football. And unless they have a significantly better defense with virtually, the same players minus some solid defensive tackles. I don't get it, but maybe that's a conversation for another day.
I like the Suggs pickup from Grand Valley State, as a rotational piece on the defensive front they brought in this offseason. But also I do think it is going to be a heavy lift for him to be a significant contributor when you're going from a lower level to the SEC. Probably doesn't have to be, 50 snaps a game, but if you get 20, 25 and he's successful, then that's a win. But still, LSU was really digging deep to find help on the defensive front this offseason, which isn't a great sign, I don't think. We ranked LSU as a top, I think, 12 team in the magazine. I might be high. The more I think about it,
you didn't consult me on that.
I say, I think you convinced me on Florida getting to 6 wins this year. I think you're slowly changing my opinion on LSU. We might be a little bit high on them. So,
all right. How about Kentucky, Stephen? Breakout candidates for the Wildcats.
Mike, I got a few of these guys, and I think they're all on defense. Number one, I think on a national level, I think Deion Walker is underrated. I don't think people outside of Kentucky realize how good he is and how critical he's been to that Kentucky rush defense. But I think I also throw out J.J. Weaver, who has just been rock solid the last couple of years with 16 sacks in the last 3 seasons, also 32 tackles for a loss in his career. I think this Kentucky linebacker group is one of the best in the SEC coming back in 2024.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I'm right there with you, Stephen, because I went Derrick Jackson.
Yeah.
But also, I don't know if this is fair or not because it's been touted, but I consider him underrated. But Jamon Dumas-Johnson, because essentially, they're being very kind about it, Stephen, but basically down there in Athens, they're saying, well, we moved on from him. And this is an all-SEC type performer. I think he walks in immediately, and he's probably the best linebacker in Lexington. And I think he'll have something to prove too. Now that Georgia's moving on from him, or however you want to say, they're loaded down there. So, given the fact that he stayed in the SEC, I think he wants to play against Georgia. If I had to guess. So give me Pops down there, and I think he's poised for a huge year.
I like it. I think if anything, there's no debate about snaps at Kentucky, like C.J. Allen and some of the younger guys taking snaps away at Georgia. There's no question about playing time. Like, you're being brought in at Kentucky to be a difference maker and sort of a rock solid force to that linebacker group. But Weaver, Jackson, Dumas-Johnson, that's a pretty good pairing for this Kentucky defense. So I'll even go be bolder. I think this is a top, 10 linebacker group in the country this year.
No, I agree with you. All right, how about Georgia, Stephen? Who's your underrated dogs?
About Brett Thorson, the punter. He doesn't get used very much, but he's averaged over 43 yards a punt the last 2 seasons. I think he's punted under 70 times total the last 2 years. He doesn't have to use his leg much. So when you think ahead to the NFL, you always think about treading the tires for running backs. Well, your punter hasn't been used very much. So maybe that'll take into account for an NFL team. But no, I actually think Brett Thorson, because Georgia's so good, maybe he doesn't get enough respect in the specialist world for how rock solid he's been. If we're looking on offense and defense, Mike, I'll throw out Nazir Stackhouse for the defensive front. Obviously, the entire Georgia defensive line has got to play a little bit better this year to get their rush defense back to kind of where we're used to seeing. But I think he'll be an all-SEC guy. Never will put up huge numbers, but key to stopping the run for that Georgia defense.
Yeah, Liquid Flame says, how about the mascot down there in Georgia? That's another fine selection. But I'm going to go, and this, again, a little cheating, but this may be more of a breakout candidate, but they got so many weapons down there, Stephen, in Athens. That's all big emphasis on the offseason talk of the Georgia Bulldogs. But one guy you don't hear a ton about when you hear about all these weapons, and that's Dylan Bell, who is kind of a Swiss Army knife. He had to move to running back to help there. He broke open the Tennessee game last year. He really started to emerge late in the year. I think one guy that is being underrated, and again, maybe fits the breakout category a little bit more than underrated, but I think Dylan Bell is underrated, and he may be one of the better weapons for Carson Beck this fall.
Definitely, I like him as potentially an all-purpose type of weapon again for Georgia. So I like the call to pick him as underrated. I think he will probably fight what Dominic Lovett and all the other Georgia receivers this year is like. There's only one football, and there's like 8 really good playmakers for it to go around for all SEC honors.
All right, how about Florida Gators, Stephen? And I hope it's no one you got on special teams here for the Gators being underrated.
Yeah, definitely not special teams. This might be a little obvious, but how about Graham Mertz as underrated? And obviously, with this season in the SEC is the season of quarterback play. There's so many good quarterbacks in this league. Like you, Mike, you have the graphic on the screen there. First in the SEC in completion percentage, 20-3 touchdown to interception ratio. If you would have told me that Graham Mertz at this point last offseason would put up those numbers, you would take it by far. If you're a Florida fan, it'd be pretty stunning. If you would have told me he would have had those numbers after a shaky debut against Utah, you'd be even more thrilled. So he'll rank probably as the 8th, 9th, 10th best quarterback in the SEC this year. But at the same time, that's not a shot at him. That's just how deep it is this year, which probably makes him somewhere in the top 25 to 30 of college football.
Yeah, no, that's a heck of a selection, Stephen, and I'm kind of embarrassed that I didn't put it. But also I'm thinking kind of like these quarterbacks get too much blame and too much praise at the same time. So I didn't go there, but that's probably is the correct answer because I'm already on record. Hell, we got a tattoo bet with cousin Shane that if Graham Mertz wins the Heisman, that Shane has to get a Gator tattoo. So and I was willing to throw that out there because that's what I think Graham Mertz. Again, I don't think he's going to win the Heisman, but I think he's going to have a great year. But I went with a guy that came in with a lot of hype last year, got banged up, didn't quite live up to it. But give me offensive tackle Austin Barber. I think he is solid. He may be the best offensive lineman down there in Gainesville. I think he's underrated.
He's on my short list for this too, because I think to your point, 21 starts over the last 2 years, banged up last season. He was a guy that most people thought would be maybe all SEC at the end of the year, going back to the preseason, but got hurt. So I think staying healthy this year, kind of a bounce back candidate, a little bit underrated because of the injury. I don't know if maybe he's properly rated, but I do think Cam Jackson never will put up huge stats on the rush defense, statistically, but he is at his size and ability can really help Florida stop the run. And some of the advanced metrics really liked his rush stuffing ability last year. So Cam Jackson maybe a little bit underrated on a Florida defense with a lot of questions.
He was an absolute game breaker against Tennessee. I'll tell you that. He helped win them that game. And Liquid says throw out Montrell Johnson too.
Yeah,
I think he fits the mold there as well. All right, how about for Auburn, Stephen? Who's your underrated Tiger there?
I'm going to go with Eugene Asante at linebacker. I think we all remember that game he had out against California last year. But, I think an opportunity to be maybe first or second team all SEC this year. I was looking through some of the advanced metrics on linebackers, and it caught my attention that he played nearly 500 snaps, but had only 5 missed tackles. So he was a really sure tackler for this defense on a group that's looking forward to this season. It's got some new pieces in the secondary. Maybe someone like Keontae Scott also fits this. But I really like Eugene Asante's potential this season.
Cousin Benny says Peyton Thorne. That is the wrong answer there, Benny. Of course, he's just joking. But you stole mine, Stephen. Again, Eugene Asante. I thought he was outstanding last year. Huge breakout player, underrated. Could be one of the best linebackers in the entire SEC. I know I like to give Hugh Freeze a hard time, but it's got nothing to do with the defense. And Eugene Asante, I think he deserves all the recognition he gets.
What about Rivaldo Fairweather, too? As tight end, he went from FIU, moved up from Conference USA to the SEC, led the team in, I think, receiving receptions, receiving yards, and receiving touchdowns. So, I think he's probably a little bit underrated this preseason still.
No.
Okay.
He got too much buzz last year and he didn't live up to it. Maybe that wasn't his fault, but no, he's properly rated, I feel
Okay.
like. All right, how about Arkansas, Stephen? Who you got underrated for them?
I've got him first team All SEC, Mike, but I'm just going to go ahead and mention I think Landon Jackson's underrated on a national level. I don't think that on an Arkansas team that struggled, probably don't realize how effective he was for that Arkansas defense. But if we're thinking outside of that, I'm going to pick one of his running mates, and I'm going to pick Eric Gregory, the big 300-pounder in the middle of that defense. A lot of the advanced metrics liked him as a run stuffer. The coach scouting last week was high in the defensive line. I think Arkansas, the defensive front's got a lot of good frontline talent, and Landon Jackson and Eric Gregory are two of those pieces.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like those selections, Stephen. But how about one guy that last year, started to make a name for himself, big time catches. I think he's potentially poised for, again, maybe a little bit more of a breakout, but I think underrated is fine as well. I went Isaac Teslaw, the receiver, small school guy, back for another year. He's not a guy that some people don't believe he'll even be a starter, but I think he is a solid piece here in a very underrated receiving core. I believe Arkansas, as I crunch the numbers, brings back 93% of their receiving production, which I believe is the best in the SEC. So they've got some good weapons there for Taylon Green in that Bobby Petrino offense. I think these receivers are set to put up a lot better numbers, obviously, than they did under old Enos.
Yeah, I think Bobby Petrino will better deploy the receiving guard than Dan Enos. I think on T-Slaw too. I think much like we talked about with like the JUCO kids, like transferring from small school to SEC, like it does seem like it takes half a season or maybe even longer. So I think now you give him an extra spring, an extra summer to get more acclimated. I think that's totally like in line with underrated or breakout. Maybe one other guy too for Arkansas could be Josh Braun. I know their offensive line was horrible last year, but maybe he was lost in that shuffle. He only gave up 2 sacks last season. Pretty solid play from the guard, I thought, from Josh Braun. So, like I said, offensive line wasn't good, but maybe he was a bright spot.
Yep. All right. How about last but not least here, Stephen, Alabama? Who you got as underrated Crimson Tide player?
How about Malachi Moore in a secondary with a ton of turnover, a ton of new pieces? He should be the leader for that group. And yeah, he's been up and down a little bit in his career. There's no doubt about it. But 52 tackles, a pick, some pass breakups, some tackles for a loss. Very versatile piece in the secondary. Also, I think he's one of those guys that should be motivated too. The NFL potentially looming for him next season. He's got a chance to have a big year and improve his draft stock on a defense that needs some of that senior leadership. So give me Malachi Moore.
Yeah, I like that selection, Stephen. But I went with Tim Smith on the defensive line. A little bit of a run stuffer. Not going to get you, a ton of statistics or anything like that. But Alabama, as the season went on, I mean, that was paramount to their beating Georgia, and just the ability to stop the run. And I don't, anytime I can shout out the big uglies down there, Stephen, I'm going to do it. But Alabama doesn't have a ton of guys that I think you can consider underrated because so many of those guys come in with top billing, so to speak. But there's probably a lot of guys, Stephen, that maybe I don't want to say didn't fit, but with a new coaching staff, they'll probably find new ways, particularly on the offensive side of the football, to get a lot of these guys more involved. So that I'm kind of fascinated by what Alabama does this year. Will they go backwards? I don't think they necessarily will, but I get why so many people are saying that this offseason.
Yeah, I think way more mystery than we're used to seeing out of Alabama in a preseason. I mean, you have to go back to probably to like the first or second season under Nick Saban to have this much mystery. But I like the call of Tim Smith. And it is interesting, like you think about their defensive line, whether it's Smith, whether it's Keenan or one of the, Otis, one of the other guys, they don't really have that sort of like household first team all SEC guy, but they've got a really solid first and second team rotation of guys, so they're going to be fine up front. It's just sort of like we've talked about, their secondary still remains a big question, albeit they've done some things to fortify the depth. We'll have to see how it plays out early in the season against Georgia.
All right, Steven. So we did all the underrated players, but this is where you're going to shine here because this is Steven's all SEC first team selections. And again, I'm just going to rip them up and rip them to shreds here. But these are Steven's selections, so don't come at me with your negativity and why this guy, why that guy. And I'm sure Steven's, he will kindly welcome all your feedback here.
If you're in the comments section, you can defend me at SEC Mike for any negativity on the selections.
All right, so let's get into the offense first of all, and obviously everybody focuses on quarterback. So who you got as your first team all SEC quarterback?
Mike, I've got Carson Beck from Georgia. This was not an easy call because there are several good ones in the SEC this year. Jalen Milroe, Quinn Ewers, Jackson Dart all come to mind. Those are four of the top, however many 8 quarterbacks in the SEC. We went with Carson Beck, though. I just think you look at the numbers last season were there. I like the receiving core, albeit, maybe there's not a first team all SEC guy. There's a real solid collection there and on the offensive line again. So Carson Beck gets my nod as first team all SEC.
Yeah, and I certainly think that is going to be the popular selection. And I'm not even saying it's wrong, Stephen, but again, we did see one game there last year that without Brock Bowers, without Ladd McConkey, and he got out-dueled by Mr. Jalen Milroe playing in a new offense. I think a significantly better offense. I think you could make the case certainly for Jalen Milroe. He was among, I think, even Jaden Daniels. If you compare Jaden Daniels and Jalen Milroe the last month or so of the season, I think Jalen Milroe was probably outplayed him just in that last month. Now, again, turn on the Michigan tape. Maybe it's a different story. So I'm not talking about postseason. So there's room to improve, but I certainly think Jalen Milroe, deserves some consideration, as does Jackson Dart. Year 3, I think he's going to have as many, if not more, all-around weapons and scheme around him than any quarterback in the country. I certainly can make the case for him, but I think I'm going to disagree with you, Stephen, because I'm going Brady Cook. Come on now. I think with the weapons they got, year 2, Kirby Moore's offensive system, I kind of lean towards Brady Cook here, but basically all the guys I just mentioned, I don't think there's a wrong answer among them. I think you can make the case for all of them.
That's the challenge, is you have like 4 or 5 guys who could be first team all SEC, and you wouldn't have to, you wouldn't feel bad about it. It's like they're all very deserving. So, like I said, I've got Beck. I did consider, maybe I'm tipping my hand here on second team all SEC honors, but Jalen Milroe under Kalen DeBoer, I think, has the potential to be very dynamic this year. And yes, he does need to get better as a passer in certain instances. And we saw, like you said, the Michigan game, but there's that potential. And I'm a little leery of always just picking things to end or to begin the same way it ended, because it's not going to happen. We see this every year. So I do have a little bit of like trepidation on picking Carson Beck, but the schedule is tougher this year, which means he'll probably have to play a little bit longer, which maybe helps the stats, which helps with voters, and maybe that helps him with the Heisman too. So I got Beck, but no disagreement if you go with any of the other guys here.
And again, to plug another interview we did, Rusty Manziel, we had him on last week too, and he made the point, which was brilliant. He's the best out there. But Carson Beck, just like you said, I mean, I'll throw up the schedule here, but every 3 to 4 weeks, he's going to have a marquee showdown nationally.
Yeah.
I mean, Clemson, Bama, maybe Auburn, Texas, Florida, Ole Miss, Tennessee. I mean, all these games, and probably Kentucky too, if Kentucky beats South Carolina. I mean, they're all going to be nationally televised. But again, the point being, if he plays well against Bama, against Texas, against Ole Miss, against Tennessee, he'll probably lock up that Heisman Trophy if he aces the test, so to speak.
Absolutely. Yeah. if you're a Georgia fan, like you would prefer the easiest path possible, right, to the national championship game. But I think in the big picture sense, like with all those marquee showdowns early in the season, you get Clemson in the opener and you get Alabama and you get Texas later in the year, like so many marquee games. And oh, by the way, you might get Texas or Alabama in the SEC championship game. So there's plenty of Heisman moment opportunities for Carson Beck.
Not a dollar will need to be spent on the Heisman campaign. It'll be out there.
It was SEC ESPN is the one that's funding that one, right? With all those high profile games this year.
Yep. All right, Steven, you got 2 running backs. Who are your first team all SEC running backs?
Easiest selection was Trevor Etienne at running back from Georgia. And the second one, it was hard. There's no way of sugarcoating it. I went with Jarquez Hunter from Auburn. This is sort of when there's a lot of chaos or uncertainty. I just went with probably the most sure thing at the position. And I like the way Hunter closed last season. Would like to see that more from game 1 to game 12. There's just so many unknowns at running back in the league this year. You can point to a handful of guys who are breakout candidates like CJ Baxter, someone at Alabama, Tennessee, Dylan Sampson. You could also probably plug in Montrell Johnson here as well too. So it's not a great year right now on paper for running backs in the SEC. My guess is by the end of the year, Reuben Owens is in this discussion too. Somebody is going to break out. But right now, I think Jarquez Hunter is probably the most secure number 2 running back in the SEC.
Steven, I'm ready to make a bold prediction. I love making bold predictions. Montrell Johnson will have more rushing yards than Trevor Etienne this year. What thoughts on that?
It's not crazy.
Now, all-purpose yards, I'll go Etienne. I think they'll cruise to that. But I think Montrell Johnson will be this is his money year. I think the Gators are going to lean on him heavy. So I like him to have a big year. And again, I think Georgia's going to pass a ton with Beck and all these receivers. And again, that's just kind of where I'm leaning. But again, no problem having ETN on this list. But maybe I would certainly consider Montrell Johnson over Jarquez Hunter. I would also consider Dylan Sampson. I think he's going to be an absolute beast. And for all the hype that Heupel, pun intended, gets for Tennessee's high-flying offense, everybody looks at the quarterbacks and receivers. They've been running machines down there. So with I don't think it's going to be much of a now I mean, quite frankly, behind Dylan Sampson is kind of a talent, but unknown talent. So I think Dylan Sampson is going to get a ton of carries, ton of production. This is a money year for him as well. I think Dylan Sampson by year's end is going to be. I think he will be all SEC. And then one guy that I've shouted out to you, and I think it's rightful not to put him up there yet because he's not done enough. But I kind of project that he'll be there by season's end, and that's Uceli's Bentley at Ole Miss. And that is a factor of just how, same thing I said about Tennessee, you could say about Lane Kiffin, Ole Miss. They're dynamic on the ground. The problem is I looked it up. I don't know if he's ever hit like 400 rushing yards. I can't remember the specific stats, but he's not gone crazy on the ground yet. But those opportunities will be there this season. I think Bentley is poised to have a huge breakout year.
I think the problem, as we're talking about running backs, is like all of them have that running back by committee look to them.
Right.
Florida, I like Montrell Johnson, just rock solid production. Kind of know what you're getting out of him. Napier has just used multiple backs in his career, even dating back to Louisiana. So if Montrell Johnson gets the full workload, kind of like to what you were saying, then yeah, put me in for him, probably first team all SEC. This also kind of gets at kind of what we're talking about Carson Beck. I think it's probably dangerous to assume like the easiest path here is going to happen because there's so much talent and somebody's going to break out. Like you said, whether it's Sampson, Baxter, one of the Alabama guys, there's so much opportunity here for somebody to come from a little bit off the screen to be in first team all SEC.
Mm-hmm. Hey, we got to do a donation from Cousin Jared. Lemon character holding his hand in front of his mouth, grinning. Okay, there you go. He's a big LSU fan, so we do appreciate you, Cousin Jared. But hey, we got any Oh yeah, you're gonna like this, Jared, when we get to this offensive line. But before we do, let's get to the receivers on your list here, Stephen, of all SEC receiver selections.
So at receiver slash all purpose, we got the best player in college football, and that is Luther Burden. It's kind of a creative way to work another receiver in there, some creative accounting on my part. But Luther Burden, easy first team selection. I think he was the first player that I typed into this spreadsheet for the all conference team. After that, a pair of Ole Miss receivers, Trey Harris, Juice Wells, and then Isaiah Bond from Texas rounds out my first team all SEC selections. Mike, am I crazy?
You're a little crazy. No, I'm just kidding. No, I love all those selections. Again, I don't know what to make of Juice Wells. Banged up last year, new system. So I would leave him off the list personally. I think he is fully capable of getting there. But swap out Juice Wells and give me Theo Weiss, who I believe he had more touchdowns receiving than Luther Burden last year. He was a machine for Mizzou going into year 2 with that system. But you were close. So I'll give you a B plus on that one, Steven.
How about some other guys that we could throw in there too? Because I like your call. But what about one of the guys from Kentucky, Barian Brown, Dane Key, Kyron Lacey, somebody at Georgia, somebody from Tennessee? Juice Wells. The health of Juice Wells is kind of hard to figure out for this. If he's healthy, then yeah, for sure, first team all SEC. If we get the version that we saw last year where he's banged up, then I think certainly it's probably not good to put him on the first team all SEC ballot.
Right, and heck, we talked up all of Oklahoma guys. I mean, we could throw in maybe a Deion Burks, maybe a Nick Anderson. Georgia's, they literally got like 6 candidates. The problem there is they spread it around too much, but that's a good problem to have. You know what? But I don't know. There are a lot of outstanding receivers in this conference.
Yeah, that's kind of the interesting trend is, Mike, I don't know if maybe 5-6 years ago, wouldn't the trend had been an overload at running back? And maybe 6 years ago is kind of bad. Maybe it's go back to like 10 years, but it seemed like a shortage of receivers, always good running backs. And now, of course, with the evolution of more passing, it's now gone to a lot more receivers. So,
right. And then obviously tight ends kind of tied with that. So you've only got one here, Stephen, but I don't mind it. I think you nailed this one.
Yeah, Caden Prescorn of Ole Miss. So that is 3 first-team selections for Ole Miss. I think pretty easy call. Mentioned Fairweather from Auburn, Luke Haas down there at Arkansas, getting some consideration too. But I think Prescorn was kind of an easy pick for me.
And I think the only one I would kind of mention again, I put him on my underrated team, but Mason Taylor down there at LSU. But you're right. I mean, Lane Kiffin's offense there at Ole Miss, when they have a tight end, it's almost like night and day different. It's wild how just having an effective tight end, and I know they've tried to do multiple tight ends, but Michael Trigg, I don't know what happened there, but what could have been. But early in last season, they didn't have Prescorn at 100%, and by the time they got him, you could just see how effective he was in that offense. He completely changed it. I think Prescorn is poised for a huge year.
Yeah, I think kind of going back to our discussion on transfers, like second year jump by somebody who's now been in the program. And also we've now mentioned 3 Ole Miss weapons. I mean, this gets back at the discussion of like which receiving core is best, but also probably a pretty good case if you wanted to make Jackson Dart your first team all SEC quarterback. There's a path right there. 3 first team all SEC targets.
And we forgot Luke Haas at tight end too for Arkansas. Again, he only played a couple games last year before unfortunately getting banged up. And couldn't finish the season. But what we did see, he's going to be in the conversation playing for Bobby Petrino with Taylon Green, who I continue to hear just they feel like they got an absolute steal there. So Luke Haas, I think he's very, very close to those two. I'd probably put him as the 3rd best in the SEC right now.
Definitely, either 2nd or 3rd team all SEC. The full Athlon Sports all SEC team is coming out soon, so you can definitely expect to see him on there very high at tight end.
All right, how about the offensive line, Stephen? Again, cousin Jared, you will like this one.
So we'll start with the two LSU guys, right? We talked about this earlier tonight of how much the tackle combination could be the best in college football. So I got Emory Jones and Will Campbell as two of the 5 selections here. Kelvin Banks from Texas, Tate Ratledge from Georgia, and Tyler Booker from Alabama. The funny thing is, these are like 5 of your top 8 linemen in the country. So I was filling out my All-America ballot, it was easy, SEC, SEC, SEC. So without a doubt, I thought those were kind of clear on the top 5. I think someone like Ernest Green, Jaden Roberts of Alabama was kind of in that discussion too. No center. I did want to mention this because it's a sort of like a nerd thing. I always like to do a center, but I felt like I would be doing almost the lineman a disservice because there's so many good tackles and guards coming in this year. That's why there's no first team center this season.
Mm-hmm. I'd give that to Cooper Mays down there at Tennessee. I maybe a little biased, but just his impact. Again, he didn't play against Florida. I think maybe we just shouted out, the Florida defensive lineman that just completely wrecked the game plan for Heupel. Yeah. Maybe a different story if Cooper Mays is in there. So I would potentially throw him in there on that.
Yeah, I think Cooper Mays, Tollison, of course, at Missouri. We'll see about Parker Brailsford from Alabama. I think he was a very hyped transfer addition, and of course, during the spring, I don't think he was there. So,
right,
he could be a guy who could be, but a lot of unknown going into this year.
Mm-hmm. And I read a story about him just today from go check it out 24/7 Sports, but he essentially said he took a lot less money to go to Alabama, so apparently they don't pay players either. That's all I'm saying. That was my main takeaway. Go get your bag, sir. Yeah. But all right, let's go defensive line. Steven, you got a lot of guys here, and my goodness, the SEC, loaded on the defensive side of the football.
Man, you want to talk about comparing the SEC to some of these other conferences, and you quickly realize where the dudes are in the defensive front, right? It's in the SEC. I mean, if you watch SEC football, you probably don't need me telling you that, but I just thought it was interesting. So easy pick for number 1, James Pierce from Tennessee. Slam dunk. He could end up being the top 10 pick in next year's draft. Outside of that, Landon Jackson of Arkansas, Deion Walker of Kentucky, Nick Scorton of Texas A&M, and Walter Nolan of Ole Miss. And the funny thing about this is, Mike, there are probably a couple other guys that could make a case for first team All SEC honors, but that 5 is pretty stacked, and especially when you look at the All America squad for this year too.
Right, I love seeing Deion Walker in there. We give him a shout out because we recognize how outstanding he is. But like you said, nationally, I don't think they know. James Pierce, how could you not have him on there? The Terminator. I mean, my goodness, Steven. But Walter Nolan, yeah, and Scorton. But any consideration to, A&M's got a couple there, including Turner. I would almost have him just because he's. I can't even remember if he played for Mike Elko's defense or not. But I certainly would believe he was recruited. But again, I'm not taking issue with that selection, but. Was Turner in any consideration for you there?
Yes, 100%. It was actually, I was trying to decide if I could bend the rules, maybe to get a 6th defensive lineman on there, and maybe you could put Princely or you could put someone else. But yes, very much in consideration. You asked about his status under Mike Elko. He did play 8 games in 2021 for Texas A&M, and of course he's gotten a lot better since then. But I think as far as like a seamless shift into the Elko era, I would imagine so. This kind of Scorton, Turner, this A&M defensive front's going to be pretty nasty this year.
I can't wait. A&M defense, Texas offense. That's going to be one hell of a matchup come late November.
No doubt about it, Mike. I mean, you're talking a top 5 offensive line in college football against one of the best defensive fronts, strength on strength, trying to protect Quinn Ewers against that front. What's going to be a very hostile Kyle Field. Man, I can't wait. I'm so glad that game is back on the schedule. That's one of my most anticipated games of the year by far.
Hey, Cousin Anthony wants to see Steven and Shane do a show, so I guess I'll just go sit in the corner while you guys are doing a show here. But all right, let's do linebacker, Steven. You got 3 here. You're all SEC linebackers.
two were really easy here. Number one, Harold Perkins. Like, let's just assume he's being used properly this year at inside linebacker, and Blake Baker can get the most out of him. So he was an easy pick. Danny Stutzman of Oklahoma, easy pick. The third selection, I kind of banking on this guy taking a big step forward, and maybe the step forward we thought he would do last year. And that is Mykel Williams of Georgia, being kind of moved into that pass rusher, havoc creator kind of role. He is my third all SEC linebacker. And there are a handful of guys we could throw in here. It could be Debo Williams, Damon Dumas Johnson, Torian York of Texas A&M's a guy that I think could have a breakout season even more than what we saw last year. But Williams, Perkins, and Stutzman would be my three picks there.
Yeah, I can't really argue. I was going to say York. Maybe I would kind of find a way to put him in there. I would. I don't know what it is you have against linebackers, Stephen, that you only did 3 here, but you cheated everywhere else but linebacker. But give me a fourth linebacker in here. You know,
hey, let me just tell you, I haven't posted the first team yet. So if anybody's got a good argument for a fourth linebacker,
So yeah, I would consider York. We gave a shout out to a lot of Kentucky guys. Maybe Dumas Johnson I would like to see on this list. But yeah, there's a lot of quality candidates here. Chris Paul, maybe another one here now at Ole Miss, was at Arkansas. But yeah, I mean, you're gonna win a lot of ball games if these are your 3 linebackers. I'll tell you that.
Yeah, good luck scoring on this defense that we have for first team All SEC, right?
Yep.
I mean, this is sick.
Here's an update because of Shane. He's in the mentions now. If he did a show with Steven, it would just be me asking Steven stat questions for 30 minutes, then me ranking pancake houses in Gatlinburg in the end. So, yeah, I'd watch that. You know what?
Yeah. It's what's Shane's taste of the town, and Steven's stat overload.
All right. How about your defensive backs here, Steven? You got 5 listed on your All SEC first team selections.
Just did 5 defensive backs, so these could be corners or safeties. And we'll start with a guy that maybe he's a little bit underrated, Maxwell Harrison. He had a great year at Kentucky last year with those interceptions. So kind of a player that kind of jumped on the scene last year for Kentucky's defense. Malachi Moore, a guy we mentioned on the underrated squad. I think he could be a real senior leader for that Alabama secondary this season. Billy Bowman of Oklahoma, another guy who kind of had, I would say, probably a little bit of a breakout year last year. And Jahdae Barron of Texas, another one of our underrated players, kind of that chess piece. And of course, we can't forget about Malachi Starks. I think, can make a pretty compelling case to be a top 10 player returning in college football last season. So of those defensive backs, he was by far the easiest one to put in there.
Yeah, and I hate to just kind of rehash bad memories, but I can't get over the fact we nearly had Caleb Downs and Malachi Starks in the same defensive backfield, because that could have been, maybe the greatest SEC safety combo in a long, long time. But yeah, Malachi Starks, let's start with him. I mean, just incredible player. I like, from what I've seen, Billy Bowman, I think that's a solid selection. Harrison at Kentucky came out of basically nowhere last year, and I believe led the SEC in interceptions. So he's back for another year. Got to throw him on the list. Malachi Moore, I get it. Yeah, I got no issues with that either. This is a solid list here. Any players that nearly made the cut?
I think secondary on paper is kind of thin right now. So I didn't have kind of an extensive list of guys that just kind of missed the cut. I think just kind of thinking big picture here, Georgia's got some turnover, Alabama's got some turnover. That's 2 teams that normally you'd go find defensive back or 2. Also Missouri, one of the better secondaries in the league. So I didn't have really kind of extensive list here, Mike. I felt like this was kind of a little bit of a weak position, albeit one that does have some guys we could pinpoint as breakout candidates, like a Malik Muhammad down at Texas, and certainly maybe pencil in one of the Georgia corners having a breakout year too.
And don't forget, Steve, I mean, LSU, they used to be DBU. Now it's like DBU. But I would, now that I'm sitting here talking, 2 guys that I would put in close consideration. I think they both, fair or not, I think they underachieved last year, but they were, expected to do more. Nick Anawari and DQ Smith at South Carolina. probably put them in consideration, but the way last year went, I don't know if they're quite up to this elite status, but probably like second team. I would put them in consideration.
Maybe we also get like a bounce back year from Jason Marshall, who could really help the cornerback depth in this conference too. He was a guy who probably thought very highly of, and then last season really struggled. So if he could kind of get back on track, that gives this conference a little bit of depth at the position. But certainly, I think, like you said, a couple guys from Carolina, Florida. There's just so much turnover in the league at this position. It's almost hard to kind of pinpoint some guys who might be pretty obvious, like second or third team choices. Unlike defensive line, it's very easy to find guys.
Right. And then this is, why I really call you the college football encyclopedia, Steve. You would have stepped further with kicker and punter and kick returner and punt returner. Those are positions cousin Shane and I we forget they're even on the field. So can you give us your first team specialist out of the SEC?
Oh, man. Our first team specialist is a guy who isn't on the roster right now. He's a kicker. It's Graham Nicholson from Alabama. He's transferring from Miami of Ohio. He was 27 of 28 last year on field goals. He was almost Mr. Automatic. Bert Auburn, the kicker from Texas, is probably our second team selection. So if by some chance Graham Nicholson doesn't make it to campus, pencil in Bert Auburn from Texas as our kicker there. I went with James Burnup from Alabama as the punter. We kind of joked earlier about Brett Thorson being underrated too, but there's some good punters obviously in the SEC, but Burnup gets our first team consideration. And at returner, Barry and Brown on kick returns and Keontae Scott from Auburn on punt returns.
Right. Yeah. I mean, some outstanding selections from you, Stephen. Again, if you're mad at any of these, just any of them at all, reach out to Athlon. Stephen, don't come at me with all your anger and frustration about this all SEC team. But again, I kid. Stephen, you did a heck of a job. Again, I can't thank you enough for coming up with the show topics and all that. So, and all that analysis and information that we can literally get nowhere else. So, man, just thanks again. And I can't wait for the next one.
Yeah, same here, man. SEC After Dark is my favorite time of the week, so I'm glad to hang out with you guys. And we'll remind everyone again, the magazine is on newsstands. If you can't find it yet, hang tight for a day or two. It'll probably make it out to your bookstore or grocery store, and we've got it up at athlonsports.com as well. So really appreciate everybody buying the magazine, interacting. It really means a lot, and it helps us out. Hopefully, we can keep doing it every year, and maybe one day get the SEC only magazine back on the newsstands too.
Right. Now, a reminder for all the cousins out there, we'll have a link to go purchase the Athlon Sports College Football Preview magazine in the show notes. It'll be the top comment. It'll be pinned to the video. So go check it out and get it delivered right to your door, your mailbox, what have you. So, Stephen, again, thank you so much. Before you go, as always, can you remind the audience how can they follow you and how can they find your work?
Absolutely. You can follow me on Twitter, minus the all conference complaints, at Athlon Steven. Just kidding. At Athlon Steven on Twitter, all CFB 365 on YouTube, Stephen L CFB, Instagram, and Facebook.
Hey, and shout out real quick, Jonathan, 2 a.m. in, where is that? I don't know, somewhere, but is that Great Britain, baby?
Yeah, UK.
But always worth hopping on. I appreciate you, cousin Jonathan. You just never know. I mean, could you imagine, Steve? We're sitting here talking SEC football with fans out in Great Britain. I never in my life could you have told me I was going to be doing that. You know what?
Mike, I never would have envisioned it, but it's the best thing in the world to be able to talk for whether you live in Alabama, Tennessee, North Carolina, Maine, or UK, Germany, wherever you are. We really appreciate you guys coming hanging out with us.
Absolutely. And can't wait for the next one. So again, Stephen, thank you. Thank you all the cousins out there for watching, tuning in, like, subscribe, share. That's all we ask. We don't ask for much. College football right around the corner here. We're going to be there every single day to get you to kickoff. So I can't thank each and every one of you enough. We'll catch you on the next one.